Hey, and this is the first episode of Total Anarchy, and I am Melanie anyway. It's me.
Rich Fault Paul.
With the same name like that, but probably more y'all know him than me, but it is also July 4th, 2018, so
Happy Treason Day, everybody!
a lot of y'all in the US anyway are out celebrating something I like to talk about a lot. Killing cops.
Yeah.
People tell me I talk about it too much, but I don't care because nobody else talks about it, so I decided to make Rich Paul talk about it today.
Mm-hmm.
He lost a bet, you know.
Yeah.
And he is an honest man. So
it's a two-person chopping block. It needs two heads.
No, he didn't actually lose a bet, but so there are certain things that I find do not violate the NAP whatsoever, but are a very, very bad plan. And when I say that about cocaine, heroin, staying up for 72 hours straight, just any kind of just really silly behavior that is self-destructive and has caused people to die, everybody's like, yeah, that sounds right, no problem there, whatever. But when I say that about something that kind of invokes a little bit more of an emotional reaction from people, then they refuse to acknowledge that something can not violate the NAP, but also be a really bad plan.
Mm.
So, and Rich is somebody who I think mostly disagrees with me on this. I think that all cops are valid targets. So I think that there's three questions to any behavior. Does it violate the NAP? Is it, if not, is it otherwise immoral? And is it strategically sound?
Well, and on the, the real question of whether cops are I guess to me it doesn't necessarily violate the NAP in that once you've put the uniform on, obviously you've become part of a group that is initiating force, you've expressed your willingness to help these people initiate force. So is it initiating force to shoot them? No. But, in my opinion, but there are things beyond the NAP. So the moral issue that I would have with shooting cops at this point is more along the lines of the Christian concept, even though I'm not a Christian, of just war theory. And this is something that Ron Paul talks about, is just war theory. And what he says is, or what just war theory says, one of the criteria for is this a just war is, can you win it? And I don't think that right now we could win a war against the police. And so for that reason, I think it's not necessarily moral and not necessarily a violation of the NAP, because the consequences of doing it are going to be to make things worse,
Okay.
I think.
Yeah, and I can see that. So I also would say I don't necessarily agree with all of just war theory. I think it's just a way that a bunch of people who were running governments kind of had to justify a whole lot of collateral damage, because collateral damage is justified in just war theory.
Mm-hmm.
But so I think that it's really clear to anybody who is an anarchist and thinking about it even a little bit that it is not a NAP violation. And I discussed that part of it in one of my articles. It's also on the website, totalanarchy.info. Being a cop is a action, not a status. I don't think there's any way to get around the fact that being a cop is a NAP violation, and then therefore anything you do to them is either defensive or retaliatory. It can't be also initiatory. Two things can't initiate against each other. So, but I still get a lot of pushback even for that. But that's kind of the only... I think that those three questions are relevant in life, but the first one I think is the only one that's relevant to anarchy or to libertarianism. And I think that one's, I don't know how you get to saying no to that question other than because you want to.
Yeah.
But then the second one...
Or because you don't want to be prosecuted for various speech crimes.
That's less of a problem in the U.S. So yeah, if one of my friends from Europe, or Facebook friend, not actual, I don't have any actual friends from Europe, but if somebody from Europe is telling me, oh yeah, no, this is bad, like, I kind of always have to take anything they say with a grain of salt, because they can be prosecuted for stuff they post on Facebook, or stuff they say online, or stuff that they say. But if I'm sitting in the U.S. in a room with somebody in the U.S., there's no reason for them to be that much of a coward, in my opinion. Unless there is extenuating circumstances. If there are scenarios in which I can think of that would be the case, but just like regular circumstances, you know, sitting in a room with somebody with, you know, just me and 3 or 4 other anarchists, why you have to take kind of the illogical position on that. I can't find any reason for other than you think it would be, other than you don't want to face what the actual conclusions of that is.
Yeah, well, it also somewhat depends on your audience. I mean, let's say that that somebody is a Leap and Oath Keepers guy, and that's his primary activism. He might not want to talk about...
Well, yeah, that's not the issue you would go to.
Exactly.
Although I have found, and to their credit, military people tend to, I get better reactions from, and this is not necessarily the audience that I seek out, because I don't feel that this is the audience that I am best prepared to handle. I am better prepared to handle some other audiences, so I focus on them. Tends to react better when you treat them with the respect of saying, like, yes, XYZ, this is how it is. We can talk about it, but I'm not going to sit here and coddle you. I have not gotten the kind of I want to be coddled reaction from the military. I get it from police sometimes, not even all cops, but I don't even get that reaction. But yeah, there are different audiences. So if I'm going to talk to a more hold my hand than kick my ass audience, this is not the topic I'm going to bring up to them. At the same time, I'm not going to lie to them. So I'm not saying this is always the appropriate topic to pick up. I'm saying if this is the topic at hand, this is the answer.
Yeah, I mean, specifically going with the nap, I would have to agree with you. You know, the danger is that people don't only shoot the messenger for bringing a bad idea.
Yeah. People
also shoot ideas for having been brought by a bad messenger. And a great example of this is if you go to a group of people and say, Obama said this, and list 10 statements, you know, do you agree? The Democrats will agree with all the statements, and the Republicans will disagree with all the statements. But if you say it was Trump who said the same thing, then it will be the opposite reaction. The Republicans will all say he's right, and the Democrats will all say he's wrong.
Right, which to me is part of picking your audience. There's certain people that I just don't know how to work with, so I don't.
Yeah.
Those same people can be worked with really well by some other activists and some other anarchists, and I just can't do it. So there are not so much of us at this point that we have to fight over people, and we can all just kind of work with the demographics and the populations that we know we do better with. So I also do kind of feel like, in a lot of ways, I'm fulfilling something that not a whole lot of other people are doing, and so for that reason, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, and, you know, I like that there are people out there making all of the arguments, you know, because you have to reach all of the audiences if you're going to catch all the potential libertarians.
Right, yeah, and there's not just one, I mean, there's only one principle in libertarianism, but around that one principle you can but you can have a still vast array of people. So that's in personalities, and so that's fine. Pretending like we're all the same is just kind of silly and creepy. And then so for as far as the moral issue, my kind of position on that is that it's not, generally speaking, it's not immoral. Although I will say, like, I would have a harder time doing that to somebody like KPD than I would for some of the other police departments that I've lived under their jurisdiction.
Well, certainly, NYPD and LAPD come to mind as a couple of the worst police stations or police departments in the nation, and it's definitely much easier to justify when people are actively going out and violating rights and not caring. And
a lot of that is, and I'm not saying those are good departments, but a lot of that is, unless you live in New York or LA, that's kind of word of mouth, whereas people know where they live. They know how the department is there, and there are places that I would have an easier time with that than others. Like, they're all evil, they're all upholding this, they're all being the enforcement arm of the state, but someone who's being the enforcement arm of the state and doing all of this extraneous, gratuitous aggression on the side, I think is a lot easier of a mental target than somebody who is more of a by-the-book kind of KPD type of department.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I tend to call up when there are incidents of police brutality that get publicized or caught on film. That's generally when I start calling up the police station and saying, "Hey, you assholes are the reason we need AR-15s." And that's I don't know if that's effective, but at least
that's not the kind of strategy that I would adopt.
Yeah. Well, I've been wondering if they're going to come and arrest me for that sooner or later and call it a threat, even though I'm always very careful not to say, "I'm going to shoot somebody." I say, "Well, you're the reason that people need to be shot," which is a different thing. But I have wondered if they're going to come and do that.
Yeah,
I'd like to start
the best
recording
idea.
those calls and broadcasting them. That could be
If you're
fun.
making those calls, definitely record them, because you don't need them to be able to say that you said you would do a thing.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. The issue is the wiretapping laws in New Hampshire would make that right now a criminal offense unless I leave the state to do it. And that's unfortunate, because there are states where there are, for example, radio shows where they make prank calls and record them and broadcast them. And apparently where they are, that's completely legal. But if you did it in New
they
Hampshire,
just don't get prosecuted.
Maybe they just don't get prosecuted because they have media bias. Or, I'm sorry, not media bias, but media privilege.
Yeah, they probably also have some content-related restraints going on there, but illegal as that might be. But yeah, so as a general concept, I don't think that it's immoral even to use what I'm going to consider defensive force against a cop. I don't think you could get any further away than retaliatory, up to and including deadly force, and up to and including beyond that. I don't think that it is even immoral. Now, the odd caveat I'm going to put on that is, in some circumstances, I think that you can be so reckless as to be immoral. So if you're a person who is responsible for taking care of other people, there are some levels of recklessness that you could rise to that I would say are immoral, because then you're abdicating some responsibilities that you voluntarily took on. And so going out and killing cops for fun, I think
it's a
would
funny
be...
definition of fun. Okay.
It wouldn't be... Well, depends on how many times you got pulled over for no reason that week.
Yeah.
But is that act immoral per se? No. But you're being reckless and kind of disregarding all of your responsibilities that you contracted for or otherwise took on. And so you're putting other people in undue danger. And so I can see how there would be an argument where it's immoral for that reason, not because of who your target is. Or
so you're talking about people with children?
Yeah, so people with children or people who otherwise, you know, if you're a fiduciary of some other kind, you might even have a contract with a business partner that says, okay, neither one of us are going to do anything stupid.
Right, right. Now, is that implied in a partnership? I mean, if you, is there a requirement in a partnership that you take, like, reasonable care with the company name or anything like that?
So
it seems like if you're a fiduciary...
We're talking legally or morally? Because those are different.
Well, let's do both.
Okay, so legally, in a lot of jurisdictions, that's going to be state by state, I think you could get sued for, you know, even if you didn't take the company car out with the logo, if you're just, like, a prominent partner, I think you could get sued for doing something like deciding to, you know, take some justice out of some cops, or anything equally stupid. Some I don't think you could. A lot of that I think is going to depend on what level you are in the position. Like, obviously, you know, Walmart's not going to sue a cashier for that. Whereas if you're the CEO who goes and announces the new iPod every, 6 months, then that might be a different issue.
Right. So it's depending on how reasonably it can be inferred that you represent the company, more or less?
That's not usually how they spell it out, but... I mean, in some cases they do. Yeah, ish, yes. Morally, if I just have a contract with you, like, I'm going to deliver some lumber or whatever, I don't see how you can infer into that contract, and I'm not going to do anything immensely stupid on camera. Like, if that's something you want to spell out in your contract, that's something you can spell out in your contract, but I don't see how you automatically get that. I could see some instances where if I'm hiring you to be a spokesperson or something like that, and I guess it depends on what you're hiring me to be the spokesperson of, how that can be a problem in your, damaging the product, because the product is your reputation at that point. But even then, I don't know if that's solid, unless your product is something like, you sell American flags and you can't be out killing cops. Like, that, I feel like that's a little bit more reasonable.
Yeah, you gotta switch to Gadsden flags if you're doing that.
Yeah. Because then, I can't just blanketly say that for every contract, because then if I hire somebody to make advertising...
Oh yeah, you could be the CEO of the Black Panthers Incorporated, in which case it might be a very popular position with your constituency.
Yeah. If I hire you to make advertisements for my ANCAP flag business and I find out you're killing cops, like, I'm not going to encourage that necessarily, but I don't see how that's in any way a violation of our contract. I knew what kind of person I had, right? They were willing to sell ANCAP flags. Yeah. But yeah, so
what about the mailman? That was always an issue that bothered me, and there was he who must not be named made an argument about killing mailmen.
I don't know why we're not naming people, but
okay. Okay, well then, Cantwell, the crying Nazi, made. He wasn't the crying Nazi then.
Spectrum from not naming at all to slurs.
See, that's why I wasn't going to name him. I was slurring my speech a little bit, and I thought, I'd wait till I was sober.
So you were taking the what's that little rabbit's name on Bambi? Thumper. You were taking the Thumper position if you don't have anything nice to say.
Oh yes, exactly.
Well, okay then, but. Yeah, so
Mom always said if you don't have anything nice to say something surreal. That's why I say fish so much.
Yeah, so I don't know why that was ever chosen as that was going to be the example, because if somebody had walked up to me and said, I want you to find the worst possible example that has the most possible complications in it of a government agent, as to what their status is morally, or what their status is in a revolution-type scenario, it would be mailman.
And my assumption is that's why mailman was chosen, because it's the hardest to justify, it's the easiest to refute. So if you can't refute the mailman, then the cop is a non-issue.
That might be the case. It might be a go for all the way, but my understanding of that was that someone had asked, and I don't know, I haven't asked Chris about this, but my understanding of why that was the example was that someone had asked him that. And it was kind of more of a response thing, but I don't know. So, but whoever did pick it, picked a really weird position. So, with the mailman, you first of all have the extra complications of the United States Federal Post Office goes way out of their way to try to make people believe that they're either a private entity, and if they can't make people believe that, then they try to make people believe that they are completely independently funded. And they, to the point where they have issued statements that said things like, all of our expenses are completely paid for by our income, or something to that effect. Which is technically true, but if you're not an accountant, and maybe probably even if you're not an accountant and a lawyer, you probably didn't catch what they actually said from a technical standpoint, because those words have meanings in lay usage, and they also have meanings in technical usage. And it's intentionally obfuscated, because it is probably true, and what the technical claim is that all of their essentially short-term expenses are paid for by, so like their rent, their light bill, their wages, but not the pensions, just the wages, are paid for by money they actually take in. All of their long-term assets, or at least all of their buildings, are paid for by taxes, and then some of them they're just paid for, some of them they rent for $1 a year, so that's really not a real transaction. So the United States Federal Post Office is, in fact, taxpayer-funded. They go way out of their way to make people not believe that. So because of that, and I've actually, because I'm weird, I, researched this in detail. Most people don't have that kind of inclination. I've met people who were entirely intelligent who thought that the post office was not taxpayer funded. So for that reason and that reason alone, if you're just somebody who applies to the job at the post office, well, they're telling you how private they are. I don't know that you necessarily have a reason not to believe that, and therefore an obligation to go find out that that's not the case. So you could actually have somebody who is a postman who is entirely, from a moral standpoint, entirely innocent of any government dealings whatsoever, because they are under the impression that they just work for a highly regulated industry, which is what the post office tries to portray themselves as, even though they are in fact a government agency. So once you have that issue, I don't think there's really anywhere you can go from there. So that's my answer to the mailman, that it's not even moral, or not even necessarily... There are some knowledge issues with the NAP as to, does someone have to know they're trespassing or know they're stealing, and those can get weird, but I don't think that the mailman is in any way whatsoever, just for that reason, a valid target. But that's not what the real question is, right? The real question is non-enforcement, non-Leo, non-IRS, non-directly stealing government agents, right? That's the real question.
Yeah, let's say a meter maid.
A meter maid is directly stealing.
Yeah,
so like a librarian.
I guess that's true. Okay, a
I think a librarian is the example I always use, because the mailman example is just riddled with other issues. And unless I'm trying to get into those issues, I think a librarian, because it's a voluntary, you go there, some of the books are even sometimes donated, you only go if you want, they're paid with government funds, they're not doing anything oppressive per se. It's a job that would be valid. It meets Rothbard's test. It's a job that would be valid in the private sector if we had a fully private market.
There would still be librarians.
Yeah.
They'd just work for private libraries.
Yeah. So, somebody like that, I think are they violating the NAP has to go on a case-by-case basis, which is obnoxious, and which is part of the reason why I have no inclination to do it. You would have to look at that person and say, have you been stolen from and otherwise victimized by the government as such that you were owed X amount of dollars that you were taking in as salary? Now, if somebody turned 18 and immediately got a job at a library, that answer is a little bit more clear-cut. I don't think that's usually how that works. And then they might have also been a victim in public school.
See, I would say that everyone who has attended a public school or even attended a private school because education is mandatory and non-attendance is punishable has
and it's
had
still
their
regulated,
liberty taken from them for at least 12 years. Now, what's 12 years of liberty worth?
Yeah, so you could pretty much take... So you have the government has these assets that they want to pay you in the form of a paycheck. You have a claim against the government for a not exactly... It's not indeterminable in the sense that you couldn't possibly calculate it, but it's indeterminable in the sense that it's not like, oh, this is $10.12. So it's a uncalculated, but not uncalculatable per se, claim that you have against this entity. So they've stolen stuff from you, so you're just going and stealing it back. I don't have a problem with that. And more importantly, if somebody goes and steals $7 million from you, and then you go and take $20 back, that's not an app violation.
Yeah. Now, another interesting point there is the welfare recipient. Okay? That, in a way, is like the ultimate benign government employee. Because they get paid by the government, but they literally don't do anything.
Yeah, they get paid to have kids most of the time.
Well,
not always, but most of the time.
Okay, yeah, that can be a thing. And there is a difference between somebody who intentionally gets pregnant for the welfare money and somebody who's just too stupid to avoid getting pregnant.
Yeah, I don't know that those are as clear-cut lines as some people like to pretend that they are. Because there's risk aversion. If you're not going to go the route of just complete risk avoidance on that particular issue, there's risk mitigation, and whether you sit down and calculate it in, have a weighted scale or not, the risks that you're willing to take, even not consciously so, are going to be not controlled, but are going to be affected by the things that you know are available to kind of offset the effects of those risks. So if you live in a society where if you get pregnant, you will die, or if you just have that medical condition, but if there is just, you live in a society with no welfare, no charity, no nothing, and if you get pregnant, you will die because you will not be able to afford food, that person is going to take very different, risk positions than somebody who is not necessarily thinking consciously to themselves, well, if I get pregnant, I'll just go get on food stamps. But that ends up being the case. Because it's not an active threat that's, kind of actively in their face all the time, so they're not really... I don't think most people are sitting down saying, oh, well, if this fails, it's okay, because I'll just go out on welfare. I don't think that that's the conscious decision, but I do think that because the threat of starving and dying is not kind of a very real thing in your face, that you're kind of ignoring that threat, which from a pragmatic standpoint is the correct thing to do, if not from a moral standpoint, because you're ignoring it. What I'm saying is that you're ignoring a threat that's not there. So, yeah, but, so welfare recipients, are they violating the NAP? I mean, most of them are, because most of them... Well, I don't know, because you'd have to say, are they taking back more money than they got taken from, or more money and more value than they had taken from them? And I don't know if that's calculable or not.
Well, it depends on the value you place on liberty, because their liberty has been taken by the government as well, and they have a claim against the government. A lot of these people have been, for example, imprisoned for weed. Well, certainly, if you've been imprisoned for weed, you have a right to take the value of that imprisonment back from the government. I couldn't get enough welfare in a lifetime to make up for the value of the year and a half that I spent in jail, or the loss of my girlfriend when I was in jail. So if I wanted to go on welfare and live off it for the rest of my life, I think I would be perfectly morally justified in doing so.
And I think that it's kind of important to point out that most people on welfare are not on welfare as a protest to the existence of the state.
Right, but that would be the ultimate going goal. Quit your job, go on welfare, suck money out of the system instead of putting money into the system, and use your enemy's energy against him, which is what they teach in martial arts.
I don't think that that's solid strategically, and I do think that there are some moral issues there. So if you have somebody who was prior to being arrested a productive member of society, whether this is a drug dealer or not, I don't care. If they're being a drug dealer and paying their bills, then that's their business, and if you have a problem with that, you have a problem with the demands.
I was certainly productive when I was selling weed. I was a very productive weed.
So, and I mean, you could say an industry is immoral or destructive or whatever. Okay, well then go talk about that to the demand. But and then they got arrested, and now they can't get a better job, and they can't deal because their contacts are messed up, and everybody thinks they're a CI because the government's trying to get them to be. Mm-hmm. That's somebody who I think has a little bit more of a solid claim than somebody who's just, that was kind of just the plan all along. I'm going to deal weed for extra money. I get arrested sometimes, and my life plan is I stay on welfare. Mm. That doesn't mean that that person has no claims against the state. I do think you can get to the point where you're just... And I mean, I haven't sit down and done the math, and I don't know that I could, but I think you can get to the point where it's like, okay, you're just taking stuff. Like, and if you're taking more than what you're owed, then you're stealing.
Okay. How about a guy who goes and takes all of the guns out of a government armory?
Yeah, so that is, even if you keep the guns, taking a weapon away from someone who is actively aggressing is that. So if you're in a gunfight and someone manages to take the rifle away from the people shooting at you, no one's gonna stop and say, that guy stole a rifle. He owes the other team $1,500. Like, that's not the thought process there, because that's not what's going on.
What if you go on welfare and use the money to buy rifles?
But you're not, at that point, taking... Like, the government doesn't produce rifles in the U.S. You're not taking money away from... No, money is not a weapon. Maybe if you're in some place that has, like, really solid coins and you can just, like, pick one.
See, I don't know. I would say, I mean, the biggest thing that government does, though, is pay people to initiate force. I mean, if we don't, if tax money doesn't go to pay welfare, then it's probably going to go to build bombs and be dropped on Iraq.
I don't think that that's how the budgets work. That's how, like, your household budget works. If you don't spend the money on food, then you can spend it on electricity, but that's not, I don't think, how budgets with fictitious amounts of inflationary money on the state level work. Yeah. It's not like they're not cutting the budget to Lockheed Martin because you got on welfare. Or even if because 10,000 people got on welfare. That's not how that's going to happen.
Hmm. Yeah, they are calculated separately. But, the reason this becomes important is with the, for example, the illegal immigration debate. You know, even if people are coming in unlawfully and say they are actually coming here to go on welfare, well, the United States is in the weird position of having initiated force against just about every other country on Earth.
Yeah.
So, unlike most governments where their citizens have a claim against them, but the citizens of the neighboring country probably don't have a claim against
Yeah, so, like, I wouldn't go to, and I discussed this on FCL one night, like, I would not take money from, like, Russia. Like, that doesn't belong to me. Russia's never robbed me. Russia's never imprisoned me. They've never done any, like, that's not mine.
Right.
But if Russia was bombing the United States, I would have a different opinion on that, I promise you.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least if they were bombing close to where I was, or something that affected me in any way. If they're bombing, like, you know, California or New Mexico, I don't know how that affects me directly, but if they were bombing New Hampshire, I promise you I'd have an opinion on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so just the crossing the line, and immigration is an issue that I typically like to handle by saying my conclusion on immigration is that I have no duty to defend others. Because it is one of those things where those 3 questions I like to go through, you don't get a result you would like. If you sit at the Mexican border and just shoot everything that moves, does that violate the NAP? Yeah. Is it immoral? Yeah. Yes. Is it strategically sound? Yep.
Is it?
Yeah, not if you or I did.
I think that would create such a political backlash.
That Mexico's going to win.
Well, I guess the question is, what is your strategic goal?
To keep out the third world.
Okay.
So when you have results like that, those are, you know, I'd like to avoid them. I don't know how. Yeah, so it's not the coming across the border, and it's not even necessarily the getting on welfare, because if the U.S. has stolen, you know, X amount of dollars from you, and you go take it back in the form of food stamps, Section 8, you know, whatever, that's not theft, that's getting your own property back, if they did something to you specifically.
The funny thing is that it's so hard to do. I've been making this argument for a decade that, yes, you have a right to go take any money you want from the government, basically. Or at least I do, because I couldn't get enough money from the government even to pay me back for the taxes I paid when I was working as a programmer.
Everything you have a right to do isn't something that you can do easily.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Personally, I mean, I did briefly go on food stamps when I was under indictment for selling weed. And the reason was I had saved enough money, actually, to pay for a defense. What I hadn't calculated in is that it's like a year when you can't work as a pot dealer because you're under indictment, but you know, you still have to eat. You still have to have a place to live. And I was mostly driving around with my girlfriend and living in campgrounds at that point. Yeah, so somebody who is literally, at the time, being attacked by the government, getting on government assistance, even if that's not NAP different, I do feel like it's morally different than somebody whose life plan is, I'll just be on welfare. Yeah. And
so it's not the being on welfare that I think even necessarily violates the NAP, but there's a lot of things I also just wish would violate the NAP because it would be simpler, but unlike a lot of people who talk to me, I'm not willing to pretend that that's the case, just to have a simpler position. But if you were coming in, or if you were already here, or if you were anywhere in the universe and you are advocating statism, especially if you're advocating a worse form of statism than is already in place at the place you are, that is what is violating the NAP. So if someone is crossing the Mexican border, or, you know, the ocean, or whatever it is, or if somebody's already here, and they are going to advocate for things like communism, or more socialism than they already have in the U.S., because the U.S. is kind of a mixed economy right now, so if they're advocating for more socialism, or if they're advocating for communism, that's a NAP violation. So you can kind of defend against that, not so much the, you know, $800 in food stamps that they're going to get, depending on how many kids they have. So just because
Yeah.
if somebody's doing 7 things and only one violates the NAP, that's all you need. You don't have to say every single... Like, if a cop's sitting there, shooting someone, shooting a 12-year-old kid in the park, I don't have to establish that wearing shoes is a NAP violation. Well, the cop's wearing shoes, too. That doesn't matter. He's also doing this other thing that does violate the NAP, which is shooting a 12-year-old in the head at the park. So... I don't see how that's really... If all people were doing was coming over here and being, reasonable members of society, even if society here doesn't already have reasonable members, if they're worse Marxists, or if they're equal Marxists to some of the worst, leftist colleges that exist, then, they're causing harm by coming over here and making threats for the state. So...
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Do you want to take a break?
Yeah, we can do that. So, yeah, we'll be back in... It won't matter to you, because it'll be the same stream. Okay, and we're back on Total Anarchy, and Rich was asking me about whether or not advocation can be a NAP violation during the break.
Yeah.
And he thinks it can't.
Okay, well, that may be an oversimplification. See, the issue I have is, on one hand, we have a long-standing we have a long-standing tradition of free speech, of not messing with people.
That's a state document that you're citing right now.
Well, no, it's a common law right before the state document. The state document... okay,
well, it's a common law right in England under the state of England.
I don't know if common law depends on the existence of states or not.
Well, that's a whole other argument.
Okay, let's put it a different way. On one hand, normally people have a right to say just about anything they...
So, I don't even subscribe to free speech. I think it's a statist concept. You have a right to do anything you want with your property. So if you're standing on your own property you're renting, or someplace that you can... Like, you don't have... Because any right other than non-aggression is going to come in conflict with other people's rights. I can't go film this in the neighbor's house. But I'm speaking, but I have a right to speak, so that must mean I can just speak wherever I want. Well, no, I have a right to whatever property is mine, including myself, and anything that comes in conflict with that is not a right. And free speech is a positive right when you get down to it. And it's weird because even most statists don't take free speech to that extreme, because they don't take any rights to that extreme. They kind of just balance everything. But even...
Try.
Well, they balance it whether they balance it well. But then I think what the issue there with advocating something like that is, even if you assumed the right to free speech and you assumed it in this limited statist concept, that doesn't mean that you can't ever violate the NAP by talking. So if I take out a hit, or if I call the cops, those are NAP violations, even though all I did, quote, was talk. So if I call the cops and say XYZ has a pound of weed in his house, whether that's true or not, it doesn't matter, this is his address, why don't you go arrest him? That's a NAP violation, because that's taking out a hit, even though all I did was speak.
Yeah, definitely true. There's a difference between command and expression of opinion.
Right, but then, so if I am able to, through some kind of political speech, or through abdication, or through a college system, or through whatever media I'm using, the media is irrelevant. If I am so efficient that I can, take out 200 million hits at the same time by suggesting to the government, when I think that they're going to actually follow through on it, you should... I don't know if this is...
Gotta turn off the screensaver next time.
Okay, it was. I don't know if that was recording or not. But if I am efficient enough to the point where I can get the government to attack 300 million people on my behalf instead of one at a time, the fact that you're good at it, I don't see how that makes it morally superior.
Well, it's not so much a matter of being better at it. It's, well, for one thing, it's a matter of how many steps removed are you from the actual act. I mean,
well,
that's
a matter of being good at it. So if I'm a mass murderer, or if I'm a serial killer, then you kill a bunch of people. If you're good at being a serial killer, then what you do is you go run a government and have other people do it for you. How removed you are is not a moral issue, it's an issue of how good are you at it.
Maybe. I don't know. I have very mixed feelings on it. And this is one of those cases where it's unfortunate that there isn't, like, some particular version and wording of the nap carved into a mountain somewhere where, we know it's the official version. Because, talking about the nap is kind of like talking about a statute without reading it, in that nobody can say exactly what the nap says.
Well, I think we more or less agree, and I don't know if having a detailed version or a explicit, if there was an official version, which it doesn't even make sense to have an official version of a philosophical statement, but if we somehow did, I don't think that solves the issue. Because you're dealing with kind of you're not dealing with a weird philosophical statement so much as you're dealing with a weird behavior. States cause weird situations, and one of those situations is that you can kill a bunch of people by calling up the state and asking real nicely if they'll murder your neighbors for you. So I don't see... So calling up the cops and asking them, would you please raid my neighbor's house because he has a pound of weed, I don't see how that's any different than calling the cops and asking them nicely, would you please implement socialism, communism, any of these other... If it's already implemented, I don't know how much of a hit that is, because if you call up the state and say, would you please implement a government, well, we already have one of those, and is that a hit? Like, if you call a serial killer after the fact to congratulate them, is that a hit? I mean, it's heinously immoral, but I don't know that that's a hit. But if they haven't done it yet, and especially if they're in the position of the state, where one of the things that they just really, really need to do to take it further is popular support. If you're willing to be that popular support, and you're willing to call up the state and say, state, would you please just murder my neighbors and steal all their stuff? And would you do that for me on my behalf? I don't see how that's any different than calling the state and saying, state, would you please break in my neighbor's door and steal his pound of weed?
Yeah, I guess, big difference is specificity. I don't know if I pronounced that still. It's generally when somebody says socialism is a good idea, A, they're not calling the police and saying
I don't know
if that rises. Neighbors. B, they're not saying socialism is a good idea, so why don't you break into the neighbor's house on my right or the neighbor's house on my left and murder them. You're talking about a much vaguer
right. So it does depend on what you say. So if somebody just is sitting in a room by themselves and says, and I've answered this question to some people who have asked about, well, if a cop sits in a room by himself and has never put on a police uniform before and puts on a police uniform and doesn't leave the room and never does it again, is that not... Well, no. It's like, to be a threat, one of the things is you have to threaten another person. So if somebody just sits in a room and they're by themselves and says, I think socialism is a good idea, that's not a threat because you're not threatening anyone. If you advocate for, if you call politicians and you call senators and you write legislation and you do all these things that are actually advocating that things be done, at that point you're calling the state and taking out of a hit. If you are trying to pass a law, unless it's a law that's repealing something or that's saying that the state can't do something to somebody, if you're trying to pass a law, then you're taking out a hit. The fact that you don't care particularly too much who your victims are doesn't matter. It's a really weird hit, but it's still, you're taking out a hit. But so if you're just saying, I think socialism might be a good idea, that's not a hit. Or if you just like think in your head that, you know, that communism is awesome, that's not anything. It's when you call the state and ask them to do things for you at any level of specificity.
Is speaking public always calling the state?
Not always, although in that case, I think that it usually is.
I don't know. Who are you addressing when you do that? Are you addressing the voters or the state itself?
So even if you're addressing voters and you're asking the voters to implement programs that are aggression.
See, the problem with that interpretation of the NAP from a practical point of view is...
That sentence fragment is non-coherent. There can't be a practical problem with an interpretation of a philosophy.
Okay, well,
there could be a practical problem with an implementation.
There is a practical problem with using that as a guideline for your society, which is even every libertarian disagrees on what the NAP means, which means that from the perspective of any given libertarian, every other libertarian who differs with them in any way on NAP interpretation is initiating force and advocating for murder. So that leaves a situation where anybody can justly kill anybody who disagrees with them about anything.
First of all, that's an appeal to consequences, which is a logical fallacy. But so usually when libertarians disagree,
well, let's specify then that I'm not looking so much to find a absolutely coherent moral philosophy as I am looking to find a moral philosophy that can actually be implemented in action without being too fucking horrible. Because
but the only way you're going to get
the effects of implementing a philosophy are shit, then your philosophy isn't good.
Right. So the only way to get that is to ad hoc everything. But the app is not self-enforcing. So you can completely within your rights completely ignore NAP violations. If they're just petty or non-strategic or for whatever reason you just decided this is not a fight worth fighting, then that does not require you to fight fights. Also, whenever you say, what should I do under the NAP, under the existence of the state, that's just a major complication that we're not going to get rid of anytime soon. So I think they're both important. I think that philosophy is extremely important, and I think that strategy is also important. That doesn't mean that you have to ignore one for the other. They both say something. Sometimes they say opposite things. But you can say, okay, well, you know, this was technically a NAP violation, but because it was petty, because it was, you know, ineffective, because I have absolutely because you're not a strategic target, even if you are a valid target, I'm just gonna ignore this. You can do that. Like, your philosophy does not require you to take up arms every time somebody violates the NAP. So, as of now, is it good strategy to go out and kill everyone who's advocating communism, or at least advocating state communism? No, absolutely not. That doesn't mean they're not violating the NAP. You don't get a free not violating the NAP card just because it's dis-strategic to attack you.
Yeah, but see, there's more to it than it being dis-strategic to attack you. How do you tell somebody you can't think this, or you can't say what you believe, even if what you believe is wrong?
Well, right, and there's plenty of people who believe that they should go tell the cops every time they think somebody has weed in their car. I will absolutely tell those people, no, you cannot say that. But I'm telling them not to say a thing. I mean, part of it is just that I'm not so married to this idea of free speech I think it's I think it's a good thing to enforce against the state, because anything you're enforcing against the state is probably a good plan, but and because you're taking out a hit. So if you're advocating state communism, you're advocating that the state go steal all of everyone's property. So yeah, that's not all that different from, like, why is it, so if you cast a wide net and say, I am asking the state to steal all of everyone's property, why is that not as bad as calling the state and saying, I want you to steal a pound of weed from this particular person? That seems to me like much less of a theft.
Well, okay, here's a parallel, here's a parallel situation. Someone has the right to be a Nazi, I would say.
Well, it depends on how you define being a Nazi. If you define being a Nazi as joining the Third Reich and taking up arms and fighting imperialistic wars for the state of Germany, no, you do not have a right to do that. If you define, on the exact other end of the spectrum, if you define being a Nazi as someone who sometimes says mean things and wants immigration control, it literally spans the spectrum spans those 2 points. So you're going to have to kind of define your terms a little bit more.
So basically, let's look at Charlottesville. What percentage of the people in Charlottesville do you think were initiating force by expressing their negative opinions about black people and Jews and what have you? And there were even some people, including Cantwell. Cantwell is quoted as saying, all Jews should be killed because Marx was a Jew.
I've never seen that quote, and he's
okay. I can look it up. It was, I believe, on the Vice piece about him, but I'm not sure. I'm going to have to go reread, and especially see if there's video of him saying it, see if there's any context that was.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to need video for that, or him to. I mean, or I could just ask him, I guess.
And that's the thing. He was actually putting that forward as a change of position. As I recall, the exact quote was that he didn't think that all Jews should be killed, and then he found out that Marx was a Jew and changed his mind.
Yeah, see.
Which is insane, because Murray Rothbard was a Jew, Ludwig von Mises was a Jew. I mean, it's just because Marx was a Jew doesn't mean that all Jews are Marx.
Okay, so so you're bringing me an unsubstantiated allegation of a quote, and so I can't really respond to that in any meaningful way.
Quoted.
Yeah, so the people who were marching on unowned land, because I think it was the University of Virginia, but they were marching on unowned land, it was some state land, so they weren't trespassing, and they were saying mean things. That's not enough violation.
And they were advocating that, in some cases, well, let's take specifically, will you stipulate that at least one person in Charlottesville believed that all Nazis should be killed, or all Jews should be killed, and said so?
I know, because I don't know that.
Well, it's a pretty standard Nazi plank that you've got to kill all the Jews. You can't separate that one.
Of the original ones, it was, but apparently we have a new version of Nazis now. I don't know. They also don't all identify as Nazis. Like, there were some people there waving swastika flags, but there were also some people there who were just, like, regular right-wing groups. So,
I guess the bottom line is, and I see this disconnect on both sides, where people who are more on the right might say, well, we should throw all the people who advocate communism out of helicopters, but then give those Nazis who advocate killing all the Jews a pass. And at the same time, you have people on the left who are saying we should punch all the Nazis, but then give the communists a pass.
Okay, so if someone is advocating that the government go out and kill particular racial groups, that is a not violation. I have not seen that. What I have seen is Antifa just attacking anybody. They attacked, like, a prayer group that was actually pro-immigration and pro-gay rights. They attacked a, like, very vaguely right-wing group, just barely right of center, last weekend, because they said they believed in limited government and free speech. They were very bad at it, because Antifa is very bad at knowing, is this a weapon or is this not a weapon? Yeah. I don't know. They, like, threw bottled waters at them and eggs. So it was a very poor attack, but yeah, it was just Antifa attacking people. Well, and that's what happened.
Did you hear that Antifa has now adopted a new mascot?
No.
Yeah, they're using the raccoon because mostly what they do is tip over garbage cans and get hit by cars.
Yeah. But yeah, so if you are advocating, if you're just saying, I hate this group, you might be an asshole. That's not an out violation.
Mm.
If you're advocating that the government go kill them all, then that's an out violation.
Interesting. Okay, well that's a balanced perspective, and that's definitely a good thing. I guess I don't. When one becomes partisan on the other side, on either side of this, one tends to give his own side a pass. So that's neither the alt right is not my side, and the communists are not my side. So. Right.
I mean, I'm biased. Everybody is, and anybody who's saying they're not is lying, or just not smart enough to figure out that they're biased. But yeah, I'm just. There are very few people that are on my side because there are very few anarchists. So.
Right. It's easier when you have a small side. That puts us at about an hour 7, so we know what to think about that.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, just because you're doing something by talking doesn't make it not a not violation. But I mean, that does give the weird. I mean, there are other people who will be like, oh, well, mean words are not violation. Well, no, they're not. But taking out a hit... So the question is, does it rise to the level of taking out a hit? If you are taking out a hit, you're violating the NAP. Or if you're making a threat. If you're not doing either of those things, you might be an asshole, but you're not violating the NAP.
Okay. An interesting view. I'm not convinced on other side. It's one of those gray areas in my mind. On the one hand, I think I like the idea of a society where stupid people can go out and say stupid things, and other people can say, well, that's fucking stupid.
Well, they can. They just can't take out a hit or make a threat.
Right. And I don't know if I draw the line in the same places. I think people should be able to advocate for utopian schemes, and I think other people should be able to say, yeah, that's a utopian scheme, it's not going to work, a bunch of people are going to be killed, and it's going to suck. But at the same time, certainly there does, I guess, now it's interesting, in free speech jurisprudence in the United States, and obviously that's not a perfect set of rules or whatever, but there is definitely a cut between advocating a political point and actually contracting for a thing to be done.
In a republic that relies heavily for some policies on public support, or at least perceived public support, I think that those lines are blurred. If you live in a dictatorship, that kind of ceases to be the case, because then at that point you're advocating to a non-existent party to do a thing on your behalf. Okay, well, you can go do that all day long. It might be weird or distasteful, but it's not a NAP violation. But if you have an entity that is a democracy or a republic or anything like that, who listens to... I'm not saying the U.S. just does whatever its population tells it to, but that does listen to advocations to it, and sometimes will then do what you ask it, then what you have is a really unreliable hitman.
Well, that is a interesting view. I'm not entirely convinced, but I'm not in a position to make an argument against it. So I'm going to stay on the undecided on that.
Well, it's kind of it's kind of an academic issue because it's not exactly a good strategic plan to just go out and kill all the communists. Don't do that. Yeah. Okay, well, now that I've told you not to kill any communists, not to kill any cops, don't kill anybody.
Don't kill the Nazis either. Just tell them they're idiots. They're idiots.
Yeah. So, I guess you'll see us next week, or you'll see at least me on
Total Anarchy. Totally.